publishing a book? Is it to gain academic recognition, change policy or practice, disseminate research, or produce teaching material? Who do you want to read it? Is it academics, students, policymakers, practitioners, service users, the informed general public? How does your chosen key audiences read materials? Like, how do they find and read the information that they're looking for? So thinking about how you publish and how that's going to get to your audience. So it's not going to be kind of the direct link if you're producing a journal article while you're trying to influence policymakers. And then considering timing issues. So if it's a textbook, you'll need to think about fitting in with textbook cycles. Trade books need long run-ups for the kind of sales and marketing team to get out there. So it's worth kind of working backwards. When do you need to publish for, and then figuring out timelines from there. And then are there any other external pressures that are going to influence your writing and how you go about your book process? So do you need things out for certain times? I've just mentioned, but are there university requirements, funder conditions? So a brief note of types of publication there are. There's a lot of ways you might want to publish and get your research out there. So there's academic books. These are things that are pushing forward conversations in the discipline, kind of making a contribution in that way, having your output of your research. But there's, these also might be kind of academically informed trade books that are reaching broader readerships. There's also policy books, so as it says, changing policy and public debate. Then you've got practice books for practitioners, community organisers. We've got textbooks. You kind of got core textbooks that are going to be recommended for every course in that area, or there's supplementary textbooks. And then research monographs, which is what I mainly commission. And within that, you've got, do you want to publish, or have you got funding to publish open access? And then you've got options of, is it single authored, co-authored, or an edited volume? So you've got your proposal, and now you're trying to choose which publisher to approach it with. And I'll speak to the proposal process in a minute, but just a couple of notes on choosing a publisher. Things you can do to kind of figure out whether it's a good fit, I think, is doing your research. So not to endorse Amazon, but it's a good place to quickly see, related books in the area. What's on your bookshelf? Who are they published by? Who are the main audiences that publisher accesses? And what are the quality of the books? So who's on your bookshelf, and do you find mistakes in them? Do you find them high quality, both in the production, how the book looks, as well as the quality of the content that your research would sit alongside? Ask questions like, what's your marketing strategy? What's your sales distribution? And consider, who your audiences are, if there's any international considerations, and access to global audiences. And one there, does their ethos matter to you? How does the publisher market themselves? What are they about? What else do they publish? And what matters to you, and does that align? So the process itself, pre-contract. I'll just do a very quick kind of timeline. So you would approach the commissioning editor. It might be the commissioning editor approaches you about your research. You would usually have conversations. There might be different routes. You might write the proposal first and then approach people. You might want to reach out to editors first and kind of discuss whether that would be something of interest to them. And then you'd write the proposal and then submit it. So proposal guidelines will look different at different publishers, but they by and large cover the same sorts of areas. We're going to want to know your table of contents, summary for each chapter, your view on the audiences and related titles. Once the proposal's submitted, if it's something we want to take forward, it would then go through the peer review process. So usually at Bristol, we would get 3 to 4 reports from peer reviewers, and that they would be anonymous to you in receiving them. And it's a really great opportunity for feedback. We spend a lot of time searching for reviewers, so ensuring there's like a gender geographical spread, people relevant to the area that your proposal is in. And then from there, I'd send on the reader reports, and you would have an opportunity to either revise the proposal or write a letter of response. And then it kind of moves forward to the approval process. So at university press, that's often a 2-tier stage. So the initial one is the acquisitions meeting, and that's made up of internal colleagues where we'll discuss everything from the book title to contents to the audiences. And then the second layer of approval is the editorial board. So that's common with university presses. And yeah, that's kind of where the final say of whether there's an acceptance, revision, or rejection happens. So at that point, if it's approved there, or there's an opportunity to revise and be approved from that point, that's when the contract offer is sent out. And then if everything goes swimmingly, you sign that, and then we kind of move forward to deciding when you're going to submit the draft typescript. So a couple of notes on writing the book proposal itself. As I mentioned, different publishers will have different proposal guidelines, but by and large, they are the same. There's a couple of notes on the slide here about things to pay particular attention to. Some of them are quite obvious, but it is really worth thinking through. And it's also really helpful, if you want to discuss a draft proposal, kind of making that clear to your editor that that's what you're that's the state of the proposal at the moment and not your kind of formal submission. So also things to check of how does the publisher want to receive the proposal? And also there's so many great book series out there. If you're wanting to submit it directly to a book series, shoot the series editors an email. That's another point of contact you can have, as well as your acquisitions editor, to discuss more content related things usually, and whether it would be a fit for the series. Yes, so I'm just going to check my next slide. Yeah, so kind of similar information on this one, tips for a successful proposal. Some of the things I wanted to pull out on this are the clarity of your proposal. So when somebody's reading the proposal, hopefully this is going to mirror the quality of the book. And so if you're writing for a more broader audience outside of academia, if your proposal's written in that way, that's really demonstrating that you can write accessibly and engagingly, jargon-free. And if if it's an academic monograph where you're trying to push forward conversations in the field, then we would expect the proposal again to reflect that tone. The market. So yeah, if you know your audience and can convince the publisher of this, you're kind of halfway there. It's really helpful to think of disciplines, subfields, as well as levels, so undergraduates, postgraduates, fellow scholars. And another important thing in the proposal to get across is the kind of significance of your work. And this doesn't have to mean uniqueness. So obviously most books are unique, but it doesn't have to be that you're coming up with something completely new or terming a new concept. Actually, what's really important is just getting across the significance of your work and how that relates to the field. Relatedly, there's a section on the proposal called competition. It's probably worthwhile thinking of this as a related titles area. So it's really helpful if you can do a summary of the field and how you see your book fitting in with that. And who are you in conversation with? What books will be in dialogue with your book? So I think that's some of the key things there. And yeah, if you have a mentor or other people in the department who can kind of feedback before submitting it, that's also really helpful. And you can kind of definitely see when a proposal's had that. So again, here just some tips on what a publisher needs to know, and it's worth bearing in mind as you're considering submitting your proposal. And you will be responsive to feedback. I think is a good one to draw out, especially my experience is, as an editor, I really like working with authors in quite an iterative way and, feeding back on proposals and then developing them out from that. So if you're showing that you're responsive to feedback, engaged with the review process, I think that's really helpful. Just a quick note on editing books. So edited volumes, they're not an easy option, as I'm sure anyone who's touched one will know. Key things with this, which is slightly different to an authored monograph, obviously, is really ensuring the coherence of the chapters, making sure there's a really strong introduction and conclusion to tie everything together. Ideally having part sections and having introductions to those parts, making very explicit how the book works as a whole. And then there's a lot of words on that slide, but so, say you go through that review process, and then you get the contract, and then you write the book, then you submit it. The whole book will then go for another review, this time by one person rather than the 4 at the initial proposal stage. And then once that's been accepted, you'll have a window of time to do revisions. Then the book can enter production. So that's when you'll have the copy editing, you'll review the proofs. We'll be working on your front book cover. And then marketing and sales will also reach out at that point. And that process usually takes 6 to 8 months, and you'll be working through all of those stages. Also, there's a section on the Bristol University Press website called the Author Hub. And whether or not you submit to us, you're really welcome to look at that. This kind of demystifies, hopefully, the process of what goes on in all of these stages. So it's really worth checking out. I can share the link as well. Yeah, so that's the whistle-stop tour of the process. And there's my contact details. Please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Shannon. Up here. Thank you, Shannon. That's a very good overview, I think, of the process. So very, very succinct and well put. Our next speaker is Yasemin Besen-Cassino, a professor of sociology and the editor of Contemporary Sociology, an official publication of the American Sociological Association. She served as the book editor of Gender and Society and the managing editor of Men and Masculinities. Her research on work, gender, and youth has appeared in many sociology journals such as Context, Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, Theory and Society, NWSAJ, and Education and Society, and has been featured in many popular venues such as The Washington Post, The Guardian, Atlantic, CNN, MTV, Fortune, and Miss Magazine, among many others. Very impressive. Her book, The Cost of Being a Girl, focuses on, it was published by Temple University Press in 2018, focuses on how early work experiences lead to later gender inequalities in the market. In this research, supported by the W.E. Upjohn Foundation, she explores the inequalities in the youth labor force with an intersectional perspective and traces the origins of the wage gap to part-time teenage work. It has been praised by Publishers Weekly and London School of Economics Review and was featured in the Washington Post, The Guardian, MTV, CNN, Philadelphia Inquirer, among many others. She is currently a public scholar at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for coming, and thank you for organizing this session. When we talk about publications, we always talk about articles. So it's really nice to have this space just to talk about books. I think before my first book, all I wanted to do was to learn about how to publish the book. And I thought if only I got my book published, that was it. But I noticed that was not the end game. Writing a book is a lot of work. And as the editor of Contemporary Sociology, it's so humbling to see and very exciting to see how much great sociology and work on gender is being published right now. But I don't think just getting your book published is enough, because it doesn't just stop with the publication. You put a lot of work into it. You want your work to be read and be engaged with. And I agree with you, Shannon, that I think as an author, you need to decide, what do you want out of your book? Do you think this is a theory book? And who do you want your audience to be? And it could be all sorts of things. Is this going to be useful for teaching? And if so, is it going to be useful for the undergraduate level or the graduate level? What are the applications? Do you think this is going to be useful for public sociology? Is it good for activism? And it's up to you to decide where you want your audience to be. I want to talk a little bit today hopefully help you, and hopefully you'll find this helpful as an author. How do you promote your book, especially during a time when we had COVID and we don't have a lot of mobility and we've had a lot of budget cuts, especially when we have budget cuts at the press level or at the university level? How do you get the word out, and how do you promote your book? One of the hardest things, I think, as an author that I had was when I was done with the book, I was so sick and tired of it that I didn't want to see it again. And by the time, I think there's such a lag between when you're done with the research and the writing process, and by the time your book comes out, you're onto another project and you've mentally moved on from it. So when usually the publishers in your press department, they send you the author questionnaire. I hate those. I don't like filling those out. I'm not even in the mental space to fill them out, but really take the time to do your research. Most of the time, I see a lot of authors who put in random journal names or different venues. But at that time, I know it's not very nice, but take the time to do your research. One of the things that I found both as an author and also at Contemporary Sociology is journal editors move a lot. Journals go from one home to another, one university to the other. And in that process, you don't want your book to be lost in the shuffle. So as you're thinking about what could be good venues for your book, really do your homework and find out which journals would be appropriate. And don't just put on journal names. Think about who the editor is, what the address is, and who would be the audience for it. And all journals have a different process for this. Some journals want you to suggest names. Some journals don't. So really take your time and do your homework and see what would be appropriate for you. Because at the end of the day, you don't have a lot of extra books. So if you think about this, on my desk back at home, I have architecture books, I have cookbooks, which my husband really enjoys, comic books, textbooks, and we really don't even review any one of those. So you want your actual review copies to get into the right hands. Now, my second advice to you is advocate for your book. And I think this is a big feminist issue for me. I've been getting a lot of emails, mostly from men, that say, why didn't you review my book? And as an author, when I published my book, I was going to make it my mission to email editors. And by all means, email editors. When your book is out, let them know. Most of the time, you're excited about it, but editors might not know about it. One of the common mistakes that I see with this is I usually get an email when the authors notice there isn't a review out. So maybe they wait for a year and they notice, oh, they haven't reviewed my book. And at that point, they email. But at that point, it might be too late. So once your book is out, really reach out to the editors and ask them. Check with the journal what their policies are. A lot of journals, just to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. They don't want the authors to be involved, but let them know. The information at this point is really, really important. Now, there are also other ways to support books, especially in this environment when we have a lot of budget cuts. As a good reader, you can ask your library to purchase a book. I found at my university that our fiscal year ends right at July 1st, and right before July, a lot of university libraries have money to spend. And usually around that time, I send them an email and ask them, here are my favorite books, especially from SWS authors. I really want them to publish, and I really want them to get the exposure. And this really helps our students as well who can't purchase the books. Ask your libraries to buy the books. They might not always be on their radar, so advocate for those books. Another thing you can do, if you really enjoy a book, you like a book, put it on social media. Tag the right people, tag the authors, especially if you're friends with policymakers or journal editors. Get the word out that way as well. Another thing you can do, and this is a big if your department has a budget to bring in authors, bring in new book authors to talk about their book. I think this is the time when your book is like just published, this is when you're excited to talk about it. One of the things I think my department learned during COVID-19 crisis has been doing a lot of Zoom events. So you can bring in authors from different parts of the world, different parts of the continent. So use that as an opportunity. And this is going to be very, very selfish, but write book reviews. I think when I was a grad student, I was always told, don't write book reviews. They're terrible for you. Write articles. Who cares about book reviews? But I was really surprised, especially when I went up for tenure or promotion, that my deans, my department chairs, even my external letters always mentioned book reviews. A carefully written book review in your area of expertise really puts you on the map as an expert in a certain field. I never listened to the advice because I really enjoyed free books and I love writing book reviews, but that's one way, especially in this environment, to support new books. And when you're writing a book review, you can talk about not just the content of the book, but about the uses of the book. And the uses of the book can be multi-tiered and multi-level. Is this an academic book? Is this a theoretical book? Do you think this book could be used for teaching, undergraduate teaching, graduate teaching, or for research? Do you think it has public policy applications? Do you think it has potential for media? So think about all the uses of it so that when people read your review, they would know these are the applications, this is going to be useful for me or not. And I think going forward, a lot of book reviews, especially with budget cuts, have become a way for a lot of authors to publicize their books. So if you write a book review, if it's published, by the time it's published, put it on social media. And if there are any policymakers if there is any columnists tag them so that this is on their radar as well. So these are all little ways in which you can help books. And these are all little ways in which you can actually promote books as well, when you write them or when our community writes them. And finally, I think in the past couple of SWS sessions, I went to a lot of sessions to write blogs and op-eds. How do we make our work more accessible? How do we talk about our work in an accessible way? How do we write op-eds? And how do we take our academic books and put them in op-ed form? And this is easier than done. And I think SWS has done a fantastic job offering ways in which we can do that. So you can start with the ASA section blogs, sociology blogs. And if you think there are broader applications, pitch some op-eds and see if you can turn your book into a more accessible venue. And overall, I think books are very exciting. Compared to articles, I think I like that I don't have to edit myself as much and I have more space to develop ideas. So I've always loved books. And sincerely, I really hope that your book is out there and is connected with the right audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Yasemin. That was really interesting. I'm taking notes because my book is coming out in January. So I'm like, oh boy, lots of good stuff there. So our next speaker is Helen Salmon, who's a publisher in the college division at Sage, based in Thousand Oaks, California. Helen has worked in Sage for more than 20 years, starting her career in their London office and then moving to the US in 2005. Helen develops and publishes books in research methods and statistics across the social sciences and works with a number of authors within sociology. She is always keen to sign and publish more women authors and authors of color and gets most satisfaction in her job from helping would-be authors turn their ideas into a successful published book. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, I was going to talk a little bit about starting off by finding the right publisher. And so Shannon talked about that a little bit too. So Sage is very textbook focused, primarily on the book side. We are a college publisher. And then within Sage, we have different editors who will specialize in different areas, and often sociology and women's studies is looked after by the same editor, but there might be a criminology editor, a social work editor, or in related kind of areas. And then Sage has a pretty unique list, which is just focused on methods publishing, which is what I do. So yeah, really, I was just going to start by talking about researching, like Shannon did, the best publisher for your project. And I'd made a few notes similar to what you had mentioned. Look at the books that you have on your own bookshelf when you're thinking of who to approach. If you can find a similar book that you have on your shelf by a publisher, then chances are that might be a good place to pitch your book. Look at obviously publishers' websites generally give you quite a bit of information about the kinds of books that they're looking for. A conference like this is a great place to just wander around and look at all the exhibits, and then hopefully even talk to some editors there as well, who are often hanging out at the booth. And so, yeah, different publishers are going to be more appropriate depending on the type of book it is. Is it a textbook, which would be something that would be of interest to Sage, or are you looking to publish more original research, which would be a university press or a publisher maybe like Routledge? So yes, once you think you've got maybe a single publisher or a little short list of publishers, and I think it's actually fine to approach more than one publisher. I think it's really helpful if you're upfront and open about that. Sometimes then we can, if you're talking to Sage and you're talking to somebody else at the same time, it's good for us to get a sense of what's important to you so that we can kind of address how we feel we might be a better spot for your book. But just to know what are those things that you're really kind of looking for. And I always think it's a good idea to get in touch with the editor first of all, because as Shannon mentioned, sometimes the publisher's proposal guidelines they're not exactly the same for each publisher, but so before you spend a lot of time working on a proposal, you might want to just run the idea by an editor, first of all, just to see if that's something that would work for them. And then often I will work with the potential author as they pull together the proposal. So sometimes I say that maybe working on the table of contents is the first stage to really kind of map out what this book will cover. And then your proposal itself, as Shannon mentioned, will talk about the audience for this book. Is it a textbook? Is it an original piece of research? It's your opportunity, really, the proposal, to make a strong case for the book. So take your time over it, do it well. As Shannon mentioned, write it in the kind of language that the book will, because it's our opportunity as a publisher to get a sense of your writing skills as well. And can you pitch it at that right level? Is it a general interest book? If so, you need to be able to express your ideas, no matter how complex they are, in very accessible language. Or if it is an academic and scholarly work, then obviously it's appropriate to write in a more scholarly manner in your proposal. So your audience for the proposal is really the publisher, but also the reviewers. So you have two audiences really for the proposal. You're making a case to the publisher that this is a project that has both academic merit and hopefully commercial merit as well. And then we send your proposal out for review, just like Shannon mentioned. But for us, we're really looking for people who are teaching the relevant course. So we're asking them to comment on, what you're going to cover in the book, in the proposed book. And then we're also asking, so that gives you really helpful feedback in terms of the content. Is there anything missing? Is there a chapter missing? Is there a topic missing that people like to cover in that course? And then we always ask a sort of a bottom line question, that if the author does what they say they're going to do in this proposal and they deliver on the promise of that proposal, is this a book that you would use in your class? So we're also looking for some good positive responses on that one. And for us, we send it out to maybe 6, 8, 10. We try and get a good sense of a good number of reviewers. And then we tend to go back to them to review draft chapters as we go through. And unlike maybe more scholarly publishing where you have somebody go away, write the manuscript, I like to review in batches. And that gives authors feedback on not just on the content of that batch of chapters, but maybe on things like the pedagogy they have in the chapters and the features. Are those useful? Are people finding them useful? Is there some extraneous stuff that should just be cut at this point and not carried forward into later chapters? So that's what we kind of do with that, with the reviews. So the reviews of your proposal are then similar to what Shannon talked about. We just have a one-stage kind of publishing decision where I take your project with the reviews. Maybe you and I have had a little bit of back and forth when we got the reviews in, and hopefully we've come to a decision on which bits of feedback were important and that you can incorporate in the project. And then I would take that to colleagues at a weekly meeting for approval to give you a contract for the book. So yeah, and I think throughout that whole initial process, as Shannon also mentioned, just being prepared to take kind of feedback is useful, and it gives me the idea that this is somebody who I can work with, you know, especially in the kind of publishing we do. We hope your book's going to be successful and will go into, you know, maybe a second or third edition if it's successful. So this is a relationship that we hope will develop and for over a number of years. So we're looking to see is this somebody who, you know, is a partner really in this project. You're the content experts, but we hope we're the sort of publishing experts, and so we have something to kind of offer there really. So yeah, that's just the sort of beginning part of the process, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. These have been really useful and specific. I mean, really instructional, I think. So I really appreciate these presentations. I'd like to open it up now for some questions. Let's see. So we have a mic here. Thank you. Can you just give your name and where you're at, if you don't mind?
Sure. Oh, my voice is so loud. I'm Carolyn Fraker. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at St. Thomas Aquinas College, which is north of New York City. I have probably a very relevant question to lots of people, but it also feels like a very personalized, tailored question. I defended my dissertation spring 2020, and which was when I started my job as well. So I'm like 2.5 years in. So this is like something, it's a wall I keep hitting against with thinking about publishing, which is that my research is too dated. And so I graduated spring 2020, which of course is pandemic, which, you know, of course led to 1.5 years of complete upheaval and disruption. And so I didn't move forward with trying to get things published in the way that I thought I was going to. And now, you know, 2 years out, I'm facing this fear that it's just that basically the clock has gone out. And I don't know how relevant that fear is, if it's real, if it's just in my head, if it's my excuse. So I'm kind of wondering, like, well, just your take on that, on like how quickly research gets too dated to be able to start on that process. And then how, I mean, and COVID's unique too. It's like the world changed and now we're in a new normal. So I remember right after COVID hit, it felt like my research wasn't relevant suddenly, just a few months out, because everything was COVID. So now the dust is settled, kind of. So maybe now's the time, or perhaps too much time has passed. And also like how to kind of update or refresh it so that maybe it could be presentable.
I think that's a great question. And what I'm seeing from a lot of authors is they're using this as an opportunity almost as a natural experiment of what happened before COVID and after. And I think with a lot of new books, I do see the addition of that COVID chapter or a couple of COVID paragraphs of what happened before, and use this as an opportunity to incorporate COVID into their research without thinking all my old data is not relevant anymore. So they think that could be a good way for you to move forward.
Yeah, I guess it varies depending on the topic, right? I mean, do you think your data has aged? Because it definitely doesn't mean that it's not relevant in most cases anymore, right? I think the key thing is you need to acknowledge the context has changed, and that might be an additional chapter, follow-up interviews. It might just be in the introduction being really clear about what the book does and doesn't do. I would say it does sound, there's no need to be fearful, like have those conversations with people, definitely pursue it. I imagine, you still have interesting, relevant things to say. It's about how you're going to say that, but within the current context. There's also COVID saturation, right? We wouldn't expect you to go and redo the project now, but within lockdown context or whatever it might mean. So what do readers want? They might still want to know about, I have no idea of your area, but that's probably still really interesting to a lot of people. And it doesn't mean it goes away just because the world is still changing.
Hi, sorry. I think also, I'm probably not the right person to answer this, being more on the textbook side, but even, approaching a publisher, a university press or whatever, they're not going to take your dissertation as it is. So it is the basis, obviously, for a book that is more of a book than a dissertation. So I think, it sounds, I'm sure that the topic is relevant, whatever that topic was, and it just needs to be developed into kind of book form. Yeah.
Okay. Please introduce yourself too. Thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering if, for example, a lot of our research sometimes, like we're not, our first language is not English. We work on migration and gender issues. This means many times cross-cultural research, intercultural context, etc., etc. So how do you go about reviewing those proposals? And I'm saying this maybe from part of my experience, when you get reviewers that are just, expecting things the way it's done in Europe or in the United States, or that you use certain frameworks. And how flexible you are. And also, do you work with multiple languages? For example, if you have something that has been recently published, even in, for example, Spanish or Portuguese, that, if you want to turn it into a different book or something like that, not necessarily translation. So are those things that you do or you work with or you're interested? Also in a way of like also decolonizing knowledge and what's produced. And so I guess you get my idea, right?
I guess it's a little bit different for where I am, in that we are college textbook publishers. So it's probably your question's probably more relevant to a more academic press. For us, I have plenty of authors for whom English isn't their first language. Sometimes, often is common in textbook publishing that you might have an author team. So you might have 2 or 3 authors on a book. Sometimes I've had authors who have managed to get some kind of grant from their department to have like an English kind of reader for the sort of idiomatic kind of English, and so they would obviously work on their manuscript, and then the department had some funding and they employed a freelance person to kind of read it and do some kind of basic, those kinds of basic grammar sort of things. And then I mean, you were talking about reviewers a little bit. Occasionally, reviewers get hung up on these kinds of things. And I always mention when we put something out for review that it is a draft manuscript. So one of the first thing that happens once your book gets put into production is that it goes to a copy editor, and that person's an external person. And so that's the kind that, the actual work with your, your content and sentence by sentence gets done. And everybody needs help with that, whether English is their first language or not. And that's the purpose of copy editing, to correct that. So I try and say to reviewers, this is a draft manuscript. Don't get hung up on whether there's an odd word that you think is just not quite right on page 24 or whatever it might be. That's not, we're asking for your view of the content and so on. So I think those are the kinds of things that I would say.
Elaborate a little bit more. I mean, I teach research methods, so I'm very familiar with this, and I usually try to teach research method from this perspective. And to tell you the truth, sometimes I feel that there are not a lot of research method books that do a good enough job to show students, this cross-cultural perspective of how things should be done, and is mainly a reproduction of how things are done here, that not all the time you can reproduce, and even you wonder, do you want to reproduce this, in other contexts, or even in the global north when you work with people from the global south. So it was a little bit broader.
Yes, sorry, I really just did get hung up on the very first part of what you said, which was about, writing in, a language which is not your first language. Sorry, yes. No, absolutely. I mean, those perspectives are incredibly important, and we seek to, kind of represent them. We don't want every book that we publish to be just some kind of cookie cutter version of another book that's been published. We're often always looking for, new perspectives and so on. And I think that, your area sounds like, obviously is something that's always been part of the curriculum, but I think instructors are certainly looking more for books that have, that wider kind of perspective, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, this is a very live conversation that's happening in publishing at the moment. Obviously, we mirror the academy. We are embedded in the community and mirror the decolonizing curriculum conversations that are happening, and obviously our role in that. I would say perhaps not enough conversation going on, but it's happening, and it's really helpful to hear what's happening in institutions and from the author perspective as we kind of keep that in dialogue. So I think there's much more to be done. And then just a quick note on some of the things you mentioned. One of the things I'd add to your to what Helen's helpfully said is so we've talked a lot about kind of working in an iterative way and the feedback process, and feedback doesn't mean you have to do that, right? So you're very welcome to have those conversations of reviewer 2 said X and I'm not doing that and here's why, and we can have those conversations. And then just on some other points you mentioned, so in our production process, we can include more budget for language editing. So that is something we can offer. So you might have a more in-depth copy edit and proofread. One of the big barriers is financial and funding translations. As a press, we don't have a pot of money for that. Some universities do. There are some kind of more external sources of funding we can point you towards sometimes. But it's just a big barrier that's frustrating. And but more conversations are happening around what we can be doing, where we can find pots of money. The thing it might be worth you thinking about with publishing options are translations and rights. So having that conversation saying, if I'm publishing this book with you in English, can I keep the Spanish rights so I can take it to a local publisher elsewhere? That's something we can amend our contract for, or we can go out and try and sell the rights. So you can kind of do it yourself, or have that conversation and get the publisher to be going out and selling the rights. So there's a couple of different options you can do in terms of the rights to the book and the language rights. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say on that.
And just to add to that, that's a great point that you made, that it doesn't stop at the publication stage when you put your book out there. And when we send it out for review, you want your book to be sent to people who actually study it. And it all starts with diversifying our editorial board. So we've been, we changed our process so that our editorial board suggests names so that it's not limited to maybe the editors' networks, so that it's broad as possible. And I think a lot of the times, reviewers, especially when their first language, like mine, is not English, they're worried about publishing a book review. And I think having a copy editor and someone to help with that process is central.
Veronica Montes, Associate Professor in Bryn College in Philadelphia. I had two questions. One, it has to do with you mentioned, Yasemin, you were talking about like the book reviewers, and I wasn't familiar with, I thought that as an, you wanted to write a book review and then you approach the journal, but it seems it's the other way. So there are book review editors who then they have a list of books that they wanted to be reviewed and then contact authors, and then they are the ones who are going to be writing the book review for the journal.
Depends on the journal. Contemporary sociology, for example, doesn't allow that, just to make sure there's no conflict of interest so that you don't select the books. Oh. And I think in Gender and Society, we had the similar rule as well. So editor would decide which books to review. But at that point, everything was assigned in-house just so that there was no conflict of interest, or people who were more interested in some books didn't pick their own books, just so that you didn't know. But some journals absolutely have lists and they let you select. Or some journals let you, as the author, suggest some names. But again, depends on the journal.
So then, if we are interested in, writing a book review, then so for us as an author, so we need to contact the journal first.
Absolutely. Okay. Contact the editor and ask them what their processes are. And especially right now, a lot of editors are looking for reviewers, so I think they would be delighted to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, in terms of working or co-authoring a book. So how for the press, how, I don't know how the likelihood of being, getting, a book proposal have been accepted if there are two authors. So both of the authors, in this case, we're talking about, we are working together and we are working on a book. So we have heard different things, but we would like to hear your comments on it. And I said there's going to be just two questions, but there is another one. So, and in terms of the book, I don't know. I have seen so many things now changing. What you can. I was thinking we are working with immigrants, and there are a lot of in terms of the quotes in Spanish, and I have seen in some cases they publish not really big quotes, but in English and Spanish. So I wanted to see, if there are some limitations, some restrictions in terms of, allowing the author to insert, in the original language. So that's what I, yes. And in terms of images, because sometimes some of the communities that we are working with, so it's a lot of, kind of visual things. So I don't know if there is any restrictions as well. So it's just getting an idea. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I'll work backwards. The images, I think different publishers will have different rules, but generally we're very happy for you to include images. They'll be printed in black and white usually inside the book. We just ask that the images are kind of supporting the text. So, that they're relevant and related. It's really common to have images, I think, in monographs now. So no kind of number of images, and the fact they're in black and white, they're kind of the two things to have the conversation about. Was your other question, sorry, just to check if there's any differences in co-authoring a book? Okay, because there's kind of no difference in process in terms of the things I've spoken to, if it's co-authored. I didn't know if you had any specific. Oh, so you're welcome to put the quotes in say Spanish and English. That would be fine. I think that would be fine. If there's kind of reason for it and it's important to the chapter, then definitely. You'd obviously be working within a word limit for the whole book anyway. So if it falls within your 90,000 words that you have for the monograph, then if that includes those quotes, then I mean, personally, I'd be very happy to have them in. Yeah.
Quick addition on that. In terms of images, again, we welcome images. One thing to be careful of is permissions and like things like visual likeness releases, and sometimes that can be, difficult for you to achieve, especially after the event. Say you've done your research, maybe it was some time ago, and you might even have had permission to use those photographs or the people in those photographs in one form or another, but it didn't really cover permission for their photographs to be in a book that's publicly available. So that can sometimes, we get some fabulous images of, whatever the research project was, but if we can't get visual likeness releases, we call them, where somebody, tells you that they grant you permission to have their photo in a book.
Just one brief extra note on that is the resolution and making sure they're high quality. If you've taken them on research with your phone, they just won't print. It will be illegible in print. So making sure they're high resolution as well as having the appropriate permissions.
I have several questions. And I thank you so much for what you're saying, because, the purpose of organizing this was to demystify a little bit, right, all of this process. And I think that and it's not just if we are in graduate school, right? I think we carry this forward and probably related to how different the process is when you are doing journal articles, right? That where you get a bad review and you try to revise, and then if you get the rejection, that's the end of the conversation. And the conversation happens, right, through email or in a letter format. And there's not really these conversations that you're saying that you could have with the editors. That's not there. So I appreciate that. And I think that maybe there's, still, like we usually don't think that we can approach you and that we can talk with you. And I don't think it's just because I think it just in general, right? The feeling is that similarly with the book reviews, you say like the idea that you would approach and say like, how about you review my book is like, no, it's not really what was usually thought about. So that's I think it's very useful to know and to share this message that it's really okay to talk to editors and to tell them this is the idea, maybe still in a draft format, and to build those relationships without that fear or that assumption that we are not supposed to do this, that this is very anonymous and that we can't really do those things, that it's not proper,
You can actually respond to the book reviews, for example, that when we publish them. So it's more conversational, that it doesn't. So if you don't like a review you get, our policy is you write back and you write a feature about why that's wrong and what they missed, so that we publish the original review and your response to it, so that sort of science progresses.
Great to know. I mean, I don't know. I don't think that is common knowledge. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think we usually are or we're not taught that, and we are not really aware in general that that's part of what we could be doing. So thank you for sharing this, right? I had a couple more questions. So one was like, Shannon, you said like an edited volume was a tough choice, right? Or it was not that easy. If you could elaborate why, right? In terms of, is it because the editor has to be working with too many authors, or why is it that you said it's not an easy choice?
I think that kind of speaks to the idea that because you're not writing the whole book, maybe this might be a bit easier. I don't have to write everything. Great. But actually, it's a different kind of work. You're chasing your contributors, you're keeping them on track, you're reading through, sending back drafts, working to different timelines. It's not just you and your screen, it's you and 20 other people's contributions. So I suppose it was speaking to that. And there's things you can do, like prepare guidelines for your contributors, which are in line with what the publisher need, as well as perhaps adding your own take on this is what you're expecting. Do you want every chapter to have the same structure and format? Do you want to tell your contributors, are you going to build in time so that everybody can read each other's chapters and then they can cross-reference them within the chapter? So there's more admin, I suppose, that to be aware of.
Okay, thank you. Another part, I believe it was Helen said, it's okay to share, or you should share with different presses that you're actually approaching various presses with your proposal. That part we know. We know it's different. Like the journal articles, it's only one, and until they're rejecting it or whatever, you can't submit it anywhere. But that's one of the advantages of trying to do a book proposal, right? That you could be sending it to several presses. However, I think we usually think that we should wait until the end and until you have, interest from various to try to negotiate. So I wanted to get your take on that, because do you find it is it really more beneficial that from the very beginning, or do you know that that's usually the case and then it's better for the authors to actually wait to be able to say, well, I want more of this or this different because the other one is offering the other stuff? Or I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
So your question was more what we feel on our end about you approaching more than one publisher.
I think sometimes people will tell us, and then some people won't, and then it's kind of quite near the end that they tell us, oh, so and so has offered me whatever it is, and then you do get in a bit of a bargaining sort of situation, and then that can be kind of interesting because yes, it's really about what do you want, and often publishers are going to be quite different. So for example, I can remember being in a situation where another publisher was offering a higher royalty, for example. But I knew from the type of publishing that publisher does that they don't have a sales force in higher education like we do. We have people all over the country used to knock on doors, not so much now, but we hope to get back to that. And I knew that their model was quite different from ours. It was more a case of, we'll put this book out, we'll sell it for a year or so in paperback, and then we'll make it available in a database library product where the author would get, a relatively small royalty from that compared to sales of the book. So I had to say, well, they were offering this person 15% and I might have been offering them 12 or something. And I said, but you have to think about 15% of what? So, for us, we were forecasting a certain number of sales based on promoting this book as an adoptable textbook. And we could make some projections on that. So it was really getting them to think about what they wanted. If they wanted 15%, and that was what was motivating them, then, but, did they want their book more marketed as a textbook, or was it more down this other route where it was more of a monograph in a way that they were going to treat it as, this publisher? So it was just what do you as an author want, and therefore what is the best, who's going to do the best job for you in the types of marketing that you want to do. So probably things that Shannon can do for your book. I wouldn't be able to do because we are more kind of textbook focused. Yeah.
Yeah, it just comes back to the simple question of what's best for the book, right? Who has area, who's going to reach the audiences you need to? Who do you want to work with as your editor? So, you know, balancing your needs and the book's needs. But definitely do have multiple conversations at that beginning stage. You might have a sense from there, well, actually, I really want to work with you. Or you might send your proposal to various publishers. We do just ask that that's made really transparent, because then we can be having those upfront conversations. Is it that you need a contract before X application and we can look to expedite the review process? Or is it around royalties or those kinds of things? And ultimately, we want what's best for your book too, and are happy to support that decision, however that looks. So,
I actually have a question that comes out of actually conversations with some of my colleagues, and it follows some of the questions that have been asked here. I have a colleague, so I'm in a Canadian institution, and I have a colleague who has been trying to get a book published. And so I guess, you know, she has put together a proposal, and each time she sends it to a publisher, she revises it, and then it goes nowhere, I guess. And so I'm curious if you have comments, thoughts on strategies for this, because, you know, this process of, like, you know, moving it and giving, you know, doing revisions every time is very time consuming. And, you know, it sounds to me like what you're saying is she'd be much better off just going and chatting with a bunch of publishers to see who's interested in it. You know, and I think that was the advice that I was, you know, giving. But it sounds to me like, again, that this is sort of a lack of information in some ways. That's saying, oh, you know, I need to have something very polished. And so each time I'm putting all this energy into putting together a book proposal that then it doesn't, you know, get any traction.
It's difficult to speak to in a way, because I'd be interested to know whether the feedback each time is similar, or is it on different lines each time? Because if you're approaching different publishers, they, you know, what my feedback might be, oh, we haven't got great access into those markets and audiences, and so that's why we're not a good fit. Versus, you know, that's very different to, I'm not sure the quality of the proposal's quite there yet, and those sorts of things. When something, if it's country specific, I'm not sure if that's relevant here, but often feedback from reviewers is, this is a really interesting case of X, but how do you relate it to broader conversations? And so sometimes that's a kind of classic comment we get from reviewers, and is worth making sure your proposal speaks to broader conversations happening in the field. Yeah, I suppose I spend a lot of time, if we're not going to move forward with something, I try to explain exactly why, where else it might fit, what else needs to be done. So it might be that, yeah, but I can understand from an author's perspective, having that happen over again is frustrating. So it might be, yeah, having a follow-up conversation about what can be done.
Yeah. No, I just was, you know, I think this is such a, you know, it's important, like this kind of, thank you to Roberta for having this kind of an informational session, because that mentorship is so important, right? So, you know, perhaps she doesn't know, you know, what to do next, how to take those comments, right? And so anyway, I'm definitely going to let her know to listen to this as well. Other questions?
I do. This is for Yasemin. So you said, if you know some people in policymaking or in media, approach them. And what if you don't? Which is probably usually the case, right? Like, we don't have any contacts, or maybe we are working at an institution that do not really have a good program that works with, you know, with promoting the work that their faculty is doing. So how do we handle that situation?
Absolutely. I think with budget cuts, even universities that had those positions cut those. I think that's one of the first things to go. When I had my book, what I did was I looked up any reporter who worked in the area, and I just emailed them. And that felt like such a weird thing to do, to promote, right? Like, I'm so-and-so, you don't know me, but maybe you want to write about me. And that felt very weird. And I think in a very gendered way, because I was writing about the gender wage gap and why women don't promote themselves. And it was very ironic that I felt like I didn't want to do that. But I think a lot of the journalists talked about their budget cuts and you're doing the work for them. And then they were happy to feature it. And I think at that point, maybe what really helped was this targeted research. And that took a very long time. To think about like who would be the right person, who would have the right column, or who was doing similar work. And I think it's a similar thing when you're doing when you're looking for publishers, like who publishes things that I read. So I thought about who are the journalists who cover, or what are the outlets that cover what I want to talk about. And do you want them to talk about your work specifically, or do you want to insert your work into an existing conversation?
I just would like to follow up on that, because I think there are some people who are almost allergic to social media, and you know they're worried about it. They find, for example, Twitter to be a very intimidating kind of place to be. Sometimes it is actually a very discriminatory, harassing place. And so I wonder, in terms of thinking through social media, it seems like such an important component of getting your work out there for people who don't really interact with social media. What would you recommend for them?
That's a good question. I think once you do public sociology and get your work out there, hate mail is there. I think you will get personal emails every day saying you just made up the gender wage gap, and it's in your imagination. So it does open up your work to a lot of criticism and hate mail, and that's there. And I personally don't like social media, so this was outside my comfort zone as well. I really appreciated SWS tutorials and webinars and meetings, so I found little home in that. I think Wendy Christensen gave a great talk about how to do that, especially a couple of winter meetings ago, which I found very useful. If you don't like social media, I think you can directly email policymakers and journalists. So that direct interaction could be easier. Another way to go could be to do local talks and go to academic venues or book festivals and directly engage with the audience, so that maybe that's another alternative way of doing public sociology.
Yeah, and thinking about other ways you can kind of back up what you're saying and verifying it. So if you don't have a Twitter account, well, the department that I'm sat in at the university has X number of followers, and kind of using hooks of other things. My lecture, which is streamed on YouTube, that doesn't have to be your YouTube account, but if you did a lecture and it was recorded, or even just X number of people came to that lecture, just using something that helps, someone who hasn't otherwise come across your work, notice it, and verifying that, I think, is helpful.
Okay, this is, maybe you can, okay, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Beatriz Padilla. I'm associate professor at USF, University of South Florida. So I'm coming from Florida. Not a good time to be in Florida. And they just passed a couple of laws. And for us, it's going to be, I teach on gender, migration, race. We cannot teach on, a critical race theory. So up to now, I'm thinking, how is it that I'm going to teach? What tools I'm going to be using? And I just had not thought about this until now, that this also might have an implication for the publishers because we use books. And before teaching, we need to submit syllabus that are going to be revised. And that implies what we're going to be teaching and what books we're going to be using. Are any of you from the publishers even thinking about this? And maybe I'm just thinking out loud, maybe we can think up together in a way to protect each other. And we are really afraid. I'm afraid. Because any student or anyone can, make a case about us, but there's going to be an implication. So far for us personally, but we use material, right? And at this point, everything is being called ideology. So gender ideology or, race ideology or whatever. Any thought on that? I know this is not about publishing, but it goes together with publishing.
I think it's a great question. It's a tricky one because I don't know if I know the answer to it. And I think we're all on the same boat of being worried about putting our work out there and during a time when we have to put our work out there. And I think it just is, I don't know if I have a solution, but I think that's a great question.
I mean, from a publisher's standpoint, we're not responding to it we're not censoring material, or we're not, that we're not having any part of that, obviously. So I don't know, as you say, what happens. It could be. Yes. Yeah, just to reiterate, what you said, that our books could be banned in schools. Yes, they could be. Yeah.
So Yasemin, when you were talking about like asking libraries to support books and like going in for your library budget, and I'm all about supporting books that I think are powerful in sociology and getting them into my school's library. This might be a small college question, but for smaller colleges. But at my school, the library, it's not just that there are cuts, it is being gutted. And as in like last semester, the librarian who was retiring, she'd been there 30 years. She called me up and basically said, you have to come rescue all the sociology books or they're going in the garbage. And I went up and there were like carts of sociology books. We're talking really old, we're talking Weber, Durkheim, Marx, and we're talking modern ethnographies, critical race books, like the whole scope. And I basically had to pull them all into my little office. And that's where the sociology books are at my school, are in my office.
And that's a great point. I think with budget cuts, one of the first things to go is libraries. And of course, of all the books, it's always starting with sociology books and gender books. And one of the things that I've been doing is all the books that we don't review that's in sociology, I've been donating to the libraries, hoping that it will get read and they'll be there, or extra copies.
But it feels to me like, as someone who I love using particularly ethnographies when I teach, that's what I like to give my students. But it feels like the school is moving away from books and in this really weird neoliberal way. And I don't know. I don't know if I really have a question in there as much as like, this is like this new reality. And so now I'm assigning books to students and I want it to be accessible to them. But I can't, there is no budget. They're not going to get new sociology books. They're not keeping the old ones. So the library is no longer a space in which my students can go and sit down and read a book.
Which is the opposite of making things accessible and thinking about the cost for. A lot of my students are first generation students. A lot of them work full time. And the cost of the books is a major concern. But we're going through something very similar.
I have a follow-up on that because in my university it's the same situation. So we started thinking about trying to get more of these academic books that usually would go to these college libraries to the public libraries, because that's where there's still some more funding, right? So at least I don't know. I know it's not across the board, but for example, in New York City, the public libraries are much better than the college libraries, except probably Columbia or whatever, right? So the smaller colleges, they have, smaller and smaller. So maybe that's another thing. But I don't know how much, because it was easy for me to tell my librarian or my library, get these books, right? But I can't email New York Public Library and tell them put these books there. So maybe that's something, I don't know if that you're already doing as publishers, to trying to connect with the public libraries instead of the college libraries, or besides the college library.
Quick question about accessibility. I assigned ethnographies, manuscripts all the time. So students complain because they're very expensive, but also that some students need audiobooks, some other students, I have blind students, or deaf students. So other formats, we as authors, could we negotiate that as part of our contract, or that's something that you will have, that the publisher should do on their own, or the university or college where we are at get that? I don't know. I mean, I'm lost in whose responsibility it is to make that particular book accessible. Erika Buse from Macalester College in the Midwest.
Yeah, I mean, I think the responsibility is, it falls under sort of ADA, it falls on the university and the institution, and they're coming under much more scrutiny now for making sure that pedagogical materials are accessible. So how it comes to us is then we get many, many more requests and inquiries than we ever did before to say, you know, we are interested in adopting this book, or an instructor in our department has decided to adopt your textbook, but we need an audio version. We need to know that the ebooks have, alternative text to describe the photographs for students with visual impairment and so on. So we're responding to that. Some things we have as a matter of course. So all of our ebooks have those kinds of features for visually impaired students. The audio books are generally a request that gets made, and then we can fulfill that request. So that's generally how it works. But we're getting many, many more requests than ever we did, and obviously we're now, we have geared up to be able to accommodate those.
Yeah, so it's a good question of where the responsibility lies. We're doing similar stuff to as Helen's spoken about with Sage, but also just thinking about when you're writing your recommended reading lists. So I know that just looking at our website, our full collection of books is now available on the Royal National Institute of Blind People Bookshare database. So maybe looking on there and seeing what's available. And there's something called the Aspire Accessibility Awards. So it might be worth seeing what publishers are involved with that. We're one of them, and kind of seeing what that means for formats and alt text and image descriptions and things like that.
I just want to follow up with some of the thoughts around the way that the publishing world is changing. And I'm wondering how you see, for people like us, many of us love to write books. So I know that fewer and fewer people are reading books. And especially, younger generations, they want to read short things, easily accessible. So I wonder what you see as some of the challenges for the publishing world and how authors should be thinking about this at this point.
So on our new platform, Bristol University Press Digital, we're offering books on a chapter-by-chapter basis. There's also Oxford University Press Scholarship Online. There's quite a few initiatives where you can access the books on the chapter by chapter level. So I guess from an author perspective, thinking about how, okay, well, if someone accesses my book but only reads a set chapter, how does that affect, how you're writing and setting up the chapter? We also publish a shorts format, so that's capped at 50,000 words. A normal, a kind of standard monograph would be 70 to 90,000 words. So that gives you space. It's longer than an article. You don't have to split everything up into 2 articles, say, but it can be in one book, but it's not quite the full length monograph. So yeah, I suppose the industry is trying to adapt to that. People, I hope people do still want to read books ultimately.
Yeah, no, certainly the publishing world has changed in the 24 years that I've been in it dramatically, very dramatically. So, yeah, I mean, at Sage, we've moved very much into just doing textbooks, and that has become in many disciplines more, even just down to kind of like core textbooks for the core courses. We used to do lots of more sort of supplementary reading, and that we found that instructors just were not requiring them anymore. Because their students just didn't want to read more than the core book, or also just because of cost. They were mindful of their students' budgets and so on. So they were requiring fewer books, so they were trying to get materials that were free online. So that has certainly impacted our sort of publishing program, and we do more core books and fewer supplementary books these days. Also, as we talked about a few minutes ago, libraries are just not buying books in a way that they used to. They see their mission more as supporting research and therefore not supporting teaching materials. So we have responded to that by making a database product that we sell to libraries of our sort of ebook collections. So that is something that we've had some success with. But yes, and then our main thing is we have, for our sort of undergraduate textbooks, have started to develop a sort of a courseware platform where we have the ebook, but also all the assessment that goes with it as well. So that kind of plugs into your learning management system. And so, and that has been, really interesting. Working with sort of instructional designers so that the material is kind of chunked. So it's not just at the chapter level now, but you have even kind of shorter chunks of text to respond to today's readers or today's students who maybe aren't as willing to read the amount of material that they might have done in the past. But they get their information in all different ways. We're doing a lot more video in textbooks now, and that video isn't just window dressing, it's just another way of presenting content to maybe more visual learners. That also is video within this platform that has assessment built into it. So they watch the video and then they do have a little knowledge check question to see if they understood the concept that the video was talking about. So that's kind of what we've been doing.
Thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause. That was very, very informative. I appreciate your time and effort and energy today to come in. Thank you for those of you who asked excellent questions. And thank you to Roberta for organizing this. Yay. And have a great rest of your conference. Thank you.